So, in this episode, we're going to explore the utilization of coaching techniques outside of coaching, which can be massively varied, right? It could be a work thing, could be an outside of work thing, but specifically the things we've learned along the way and have mastered and have become well practiced when we're coaching, how do they have other applications? I guess that's what would be really interesting to explore. So Lou, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think for me, outside of my business and work life, it's parenting for me, coaching skills and parenting. That's been absolutely huge, even from them being really young. So I trained 16 odd years ago, so my kids were really young at that point. One wasn't even born. Even as a 3-year-old, rather than asking a closed question, the impact asking an open question has even on a child that young. My kids are teenagers now, and I'm using those coaching skills probably even more so, even though they can probably see through it, and they do, and sometimes they tell me off. But just to throw the question back, what do you think? What do you think about that? Just as simple as that, just it allows them to think for themselves, find their own solution. So for me, parenting and using my coaching skills within my parenting has been absolutely life-changing. I think it's helped make me a better parent. I'm not perfect, but it certainly had a major impact.
I was going to ask you about the impact there. Like, how do you measure? I'm asking this now because I've got 2 young kids and I need all the help I can get, clearly. But what do you think? What change did it create, do you think, when you were asking those sorts of questions with the kids?
The answers are within them. They're powerful beings. I don't have all the answers. I think that it's empowerment, isn't it? I believe in you, that you can find your own answers. And just, I mean, there's so many examples. My daughter, this is going back to GCSEs a couple of years ago, and she said to me, I'm really nervous about it. And even something like that, and she was worried about revising, and I just asked open questions. It was about World War II, and she was, what about that? Tell me more about that. And how does that work? And I helped her revise without her even knowing that's what I was doing. So we were just having this conversation, and just by asking lots of open questions, and it was getting her to recall things and dates. And when did that happen? So it's as simple as that, really. And it's a big part of my coaching, parenting toolkit. Yeah.
I think empowerment, as you were saying, that is the word that really came up for me when I was listening to that. And I think I don't know whether it's accountability, or there's less reliance on parents, because actually the answers are within them. And something I know, I've got an example that's really jumped out with me with my goddaughters, where one of them was worried about something, and it was kind of becoming a bit, and I kind of did how would it be if it was okay, or it was and it was kind of getting her to think about, let's think about if you could do it, or if you rather than thinking I can't, it's actually, well, how would it be if you could? And then we almost work backwards, and I found that really, really useful, I think, with everybody. But I can think of an example, as I say, with younger members of family.
And it's challenging self-limiting beliefs is what we would call that, isn't it, in coaching? So why wouldn't you do it for your loved ones and stuff, is the thing that's just made me reflect on there, Ali. Why wouldn't you do that, especially with kids?
Kids are less resistant. If I try coaching my husband, doesn't work so well. Kids are much more receptive, and younger kids, not so much teenagers. They can see what you're doing, but yeah.
For me, listening to you, Lou, I would say I don't think I probably not consciously used masses of coaching techniques when my kids were younger, but absolutely as they've grown into being teenagers, and that kind of setting them up to fly thing, and that building that personal accountability, personal responsibility, and that confidence in their own ability. I think that's definitely more so. It's really made me think about whether I could have done it, and whether it was, this is my personal view, whether it's relevant for younger children. There is a reason why we call it the parent-child relationship. There are certain things we have to teach them. There are certain parameters we have to kind of instill in them. There are certain kind of don't touch fire messages we have to give them. But I agree, there are also those lovely conversations after school where you can kind of go, so what was the best thing about school? Or ask more coaching open questions and not probe too much, and drill down about achievement. How did it feel to do that activity is better than where did you come in the class. So I absolutely hear there are certain nuggets for younger kids, but for me it's been really much more beneficial for older kids, for the teenagers, to really learn about, allow them to explore who they are. And you'll know this, Lou, from having 2 kids and a boy and a girl, they're vastly different, aren't they? How they learn, how they interact, what their social development, the speed of things. And I think adopting a more coaching stance with them stops some of that comparison. Well, your sister did it by the time she was 15 or whatever. So for me, that's been much more useful as they've grown older, definitely.
And there's something as well that this is forcing me to reflect quite a lot, actually, this conversation. But so my youngest I can tell already, he's a bit of a worrier. You know what I mean? And just the fact that he can have a conversation, an open conversation, and share stuff, I think is quite a healthy thing. Do you know what I mean? Just to get into the habit, and that's the norm of, having someone who's curious and the safe space, the safe environment that we create as coaches for clients, that you can have that as well. Because it's not a guarantee, is it? You would think you would have that with loved ones, children, parents, whatever, but it's not always a guarantee. So yeah, what from your perspective then, Louise, what other applications for coaching or coaching techniques have you got?
I think from a work perspective, so as we've talked about, those skills that we kind of innately possess or develop or refine as coaches are so useful, aren't they, in team environments, in rapport building, in networking in organisations, building relationships with stakeholders. All of that kind of stuff is a given. And someone might be super good at that and not be a coach, obviously. But I think that our self-awareness and some of those techniques that we've really developed and honed over the years come easier, it's smoother, it's quicker to happen. So we can kind of progress projects or relationships or influence outcomes at work maybe easier, more efficiently, if that makes sense. So where I'm currently employed as a coach, it's a new group that's come together. So similar to you guys, we had that experience last year. And actually there's all that storming, forming, norming. Well, actually having that kind of understanding and self-awareness, we kind of know that that's okay. And we will go through that, and that's perfectly fine. And these are perhaps tricks or tools to employ to make that less painful or quicker, go through those motions or whatever. But it's okay to go through all of those kind of bumps and ups and downs. So I think it really adds a richness to the conversations you have, but it also allays any fears that you might have about your place in the team or how to connect with certain individuals that do feel a bit weird or spiky or not my usual cup of tea. And I think coaches are really good at overcoming some of those barriers in a team environment.
I think, yeah, definitely in the work situation, as it stands at the moment, I line manage coaches, so they're used to kind of open questions, and I'm going to say working some of that out for themselves, but definitely in the past, that kind of use of open questions and going back, like you were saying with children, but empowering people to find the answers within them. The other bit that's been really useful for me is that use of silence that you have in coaching. When you ask a question, you're silent, you wait for the answer. If nothing's said, you still wait. Or at the end, when someone's spoken, you have that silence. I found that's been really, really useful in work situations around encouraging those who maybe wouldn't normally speak to speak. Or I actually find it's when I've been having sometimes a tricky conversation, or you're having to give some developmental feedback back or talk about something that's perhaps not gone so well, is, you let the statement land and then you're silent, giving the other person the space to respond rather than filling in it, I think you should now do this or whatever. I think that silence is really useful in terms of just creating space for others, but also it stops me from jumping in and volunteering for something, or I need to do it, I need to,
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk, isn't there? And there has been for many years about, leadership styles, management styles being more coach influenced. But not to be too disparaging about that, because there'll be a lot of good programs and organizations who buy into it. But what I see a lot is, let's introduce grow, and then that's how you structure your conversation, and then that's probably about it. But what you've just said there about actually being able to flick the switch. So the biggest shift have had since becoming a coach is being able to flick that switch between being the person who's there to guide and advise, which it's what a manager does, and then being able to flick the switch between, now I'm there to withhold judgment, be non-directive, it's not my space. And that takes practice, doesn't it, to be able to shift gear from one thing to the other, but we all have to do it. And I just, from a management leadership perspective in organization, instead of that once a month hour one-to-one to just regurgitate everything we know already, and the manager just talks at you for an hour and tells you what to think, imagine it was a proper coaching session just once a month. I don't think it's a lot to ask, so if that could be applied, there's a call to arms for all managers, team leaders listening. Imagine that once a month there was a coaching session, a proper coaching session using these techniques. That would be quite nice, but I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, but it definitely would add value. And those techniques it doesn't have to be called a coaching session, but those techniques could definitely add value, I think.
I think there is a real need for that and a gap, isn't there? And I wonder if you could take it to the next level. And actually, it's not called a coaching session, and it isn't for an hour, and it's not on a specified Tuesday afternoon once a month. It's just part of those everyday coaching conversations and everyday catch-ups. So I think actually that's the ultimate aim, isn't it? So not that managers would even recognise that they're coaching. They kind of do. But actually, the person in front of them doesn't say, I've just been coached. They just say, I've had a really lovely conversation and I've got clarity on my goals, or I feel heard. Actually, that's the ultimate, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and the technique there is learning to switch off your ego of needing to know the answer every time, or your ego of being the boss who needs to direct. That falls into the category of a technique for me. Do you know what I mean?
Sometimes, if you're in, I'm going to say, if you're not saying office environment, but an environment where you're working physically with the person, not virtually, sometimes a walk and talk is a really good way of doing that, because you're side by side, you're not face to face, it's not one versus the other. I think something else that when you're just saying about, I kind of think, I guess some of the different tools and techniques I've learned as a coach, how I apply those sometimes in conversation. So the drama triangle is often a big kind of one for me, around victim, rescuer, persecutor. And I can have a tendency to sometimes persecutor, but probably more often than not rescuer. And I have a tendency, particularly with outside of work, is that there'll be, I can't do this, and I automatically go into rescuer mode. Whereas now I try and flick that switch, don't rescue, enable the other person to be resourceful, because actually it's then empowering them. So I know that's I guess a tool that I sometimes refer back to quite a lot, to see where I sometimes slip into a place that I shouldn't slip into. So I think that, you can sometimes apply, a lot of, I guess that's around TA and transaction analysis, but there's a lot of the different models and tools that often kind of often after a situation, I think I could have done something different, but sometimes when I'm in it, that make me think, okay, let me use this in a different way.
It's twofold then, isn't it? So as a trained and experienced coach, how we interact with others in organizational settings, but then also how we ourselves present and act and behave. So it's twofold, isn't it? It's a win-win really in that, because that's really interesting, isn't it? Ali, you're saying actually, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I wonder if before you were an experienced coach, would you have ever even thought of reflecting and saying, gosh, could I have handled that differently? So even that in itself is just a really useful thing.
I was the world's worst reflector, and I'm by no means there now, but I reflect so much more because I see the value of it. and where something's, I kind of know for myself, if there's something still niggling away, it's because I've not tackled it, or I've not sorted it yet. So I need to either do a bit more reflection on it, or I need to do something about it. So yeah, it's definitely makes me think differently and react differently in some situations.
And I'm thinking, thinking about coaching skills that sort of infiltrate into all areas of our life. But for me, the biggest one is, and certainly as an early coach, I'm not an early coach, I'm just thinking back to those early days, was listening, just listening on a different level, not just listening to what's being said, but the essence of what's being said, and looking out for those shifts in energy, and reading the room, looking at the body language, intuition, which is something, of course, that we all have. It just, as coaches, we develop that. So for me, it's listening, and that's been so enlightening, and certainly was in the early days of being a coach, even if it was in the supermarket, listening to a conversation and thinking, oh, might be some limiting beliefs going on there, and I'd love to ask that question if they were my coaching client. So yeah, just listening at a different level, and that, with family members in the workplace, with line reports, with friends, with kids. Yeah, you can hear so much more with that coaching ear.
Because it's one of those things, everyone thinks that they listen really well, don't they? But without a deliberate focus and without it being intentional, we hear a lot of things, but do we really listen deeply? So I totally agree with it. It's a difficult thing to quantify if people, and I think the majority of our audiences are coaches or coaches in development, so they will get it. But for those who maybe don't or haven't coached, it's quite difficult to quantify, but it is completely different. I just think as well, even just whilst we sort of wrap up talking about the organisational thing, team meetings, I was fascinated by them. So even a highly functioning, high performing team, when they get together, it's a competitive environment, to have your voice heard, to get your ideas across. And often, which obviously happens in team meetings a lot, when you hit an impasse, it needs somebody to facilitate, doesn't it? It needs somebody to ask the question rather than try and get their point across. And I think, Louise, you mentioned influence before as well. I think that's the influential bit. I think people misinterpret being influential. Like, influence must be, I get my way and that's it. That's different. I think influence is a win-win. We all meet somewhere in the middle and get stuff done. And I think that's what the person who can take a step back, listen properly, and ask the questions of people to draw out more of what needs to be drawn out could be, that's the thing that adds value. So, I mean, others may disagree, but I think that's been really influential.
Yeah. And I think sometimes the most influential person in the room actually can be the quietest. It's just that they use that influence and they wield it at the right moment or the appropriate time. So you're right, that sometimes that kind of not clash, but that competitiveness that might go on in a high performing team, any team, a dysfunctional team as well. It is not necessarily about the loudest, the biggest, the brightest, the boldest. It is about that person that can hold the room or hold the silence or ask that really powerful question at the right moment and stop and stun everyone else into silence, and that step back and that, oh yeah, right, I get it, and that shift that can happen. And I think that's a really powerful tool and technique as well. That definitely takes honing. That's a really good one to develop and work on over the years.
Yeah, definitely. The final sort of, and it's very similar to what's been said already, but just to throw in another sort of perspective on it, which is just something I've been involved in the last couple of years, is sort of grassroots sports coaching, which, I think a lot of people arrive at the word coach through things like sport. And I've been fascinated observing and learning myself through becoming a qualified football coach and stuff like that about how to do it and how to go about it. And it's hugely directive. It's not coaching. 90% of the time it's not. It's teaching, because you're teaching, in my case, young kids technique, and it's instruction and they're learning the game. But obviously trying to bring some coaching bits and pieces, and you do see a difference, similar to you with the kids, Lou, through rather than just, where do you want us in this game, coach? Well, talk to your teammates and figure out, are you going to have the conversation, or where do you think's the right place to stand here? It's more sustainable when they figure that out than just constantly being told all the time. But I have noticed, which is quite positive in that environment, there is a real shift towards our way of thinking, our professional industry's way of thinking. And some of the elite coaches that, you get exposure to through training and whatnot, they're very much hands off. Once people understand the game, the sport, whatever it is, then let them figure it out. Just give them space. Sometimes you don't need to even ask a question, just let them get on with it. So even in that environment, which is very directive in its nature, they're starting to, come around to our way of thinking without it sounding too grand. So it's really interesting.
And this sort of sparks something with my son who plays football, and my husband did a qualification to help with running the club. But you're right, so at grassroots level they're so directive. Even the training, actually, it was called coaching but really wasn't. But interestingly, my son had some time in an academy, and it was very different observing those what are they, UEFA B or whatever coaches, and how they were much more non-directive, much more sort of in our space, and much more silent. There wasn't as much shouting on the sidelines that we all do on a Sunday morning. It was much calmer. So it was really interesting to see that difference. So I agree with you, Stephen.
I think there's this bit as well with elite sports, that so much more emphasis, as well as is put on the mind, as well as the body and the skill. So the mind bit is very, very important. And I know with the football team that I follow, I'd say probably our coach is very directive he's very directive on the side of the pitch, because he's always gesticulating and everything, but he's very much created a vision, and however he's done it, he's got the team to buy into that vision so that they all know the roles that they play. But again, it's that mindset. It's about having that, the whatever's been done around their mindset, the mindset has definitely changed, and you can hear that in the way that they talk. You can see that in the way that they play and they react to, things not going the way that they want to on the pitch. So there's definitely something around, it's, once they go out on the pitch, it's down to the people on the team. So, the manager can shout and scream and everything at the side, but it's down to those people there. And I think so much more in that environment is being explored, and great to see that at grassroots level, or starting to come through at grassroots level, because again, it just, those kind of skills and life skills that you learn not necessarily in school, but doing stuff like this, that kind of thing, that really ripples into other areas of your life.
And sustainability of coaching, isn't it? I think, from kids all the way through to the the adults and the professionals that we work with. Actually, what we're doing is equipping them to self-serve and sustain through the rest of their lives, basically. So it's a really good point to think about.
It's professional footballers, rugby players, bankers, council workers, whatever it is, they know their job, don't they? Do you know what I mean? They know what they're doing. They've acquired a level of expertise and knowledge. I'm sure there was a quote, and I wish I could remember who I got attributed to, but something along the lines of coaching's what happens when you know it all, if that makes sense. It's like kind of what's left. You've got the knowledge, you've got the skill, you've acquired that. So what's left to do? Coach, But I agree. The earlier you can start with that sort of stuff, the better. Any other examples through conversation we've thought about where coaching techniques have you've been able to apply them?
You, Stephen, what do you think?
Well, stop coaching us, Louise. Podcast recordings. No, I think from my own experience, should we put a veto on partners? Should we just be that, say it just doesn't work for partners if you value your life? in my case. No, I think it has, in all seriousness, massively wider applications at work in pretty much all circumstances. Every interaction could be a chance to be more coach-like, on, at service of somebody else, rather than just being a competitive voice or directing voice. And I think that adds value. And yeah, the sports thing's just very personal because I'm doing it and I see it, and I the shouting and bawling, Lou, I can't quite cope with it when I hear it and I see it, and it really grinds on us. So I'd like to think I have a more balanced approach, and I'm seeing more of it, which is really pleasing. But yeah, there's no getting away from the fact that there is still a way to go on that.
Oh, it's a bit old school still, isn't it? Yeah.
Very much so. Yeah.
I think what's clear from this conversation is how coaching can infiltrate so many different aspects of your life. And for me, coaching has been life-changing because it feeds into everything, even conversations with your kids at work, in meetings, on the football pitch, even with your partner to a certain extent. It's huge, isn't it? The impact.
The impact it has on us as individuals, and then the way that we respond to others. So, you might not be able to coach your partner in marriage, but actually how you show up as a partner in marriage, actually maybe having just the desired effect and maybe beneficial and contributing to a much more harmonious partnership anyway, just by doing that. So actually, it's just a win-win everywhere, isn't it?